A friend of mine was selling firewood he'd made from trees on his property that he'd cut down, bucked up, and split. A potential customer was looking this over and he said, "Your wood looks old." And my friend said, "It is old. I've aged it for you. I don't sell green wood." The man thought for a moment, studying the wood. Then he said, "You think you can fool me? I'm not buying any old wood." And he left. I'm thinking about firewood because I was thinking about Thoreau, Henry Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, born, oddly enough, David Henry Thoreau. I think he would be a person who would put up his own firewood and never burn green wood, except in an emergency. I also have a suspicion, not backed by any knowledge, that he would have been a nettlesome person in any community, what we would commonly call a pain in the ass. The time he spent apart from others at the pond, Walden, I don't think he was greatly missed by anyone. I did not read his famous work, Walden, until later in my life. Why this is so, I can't recall. I did not avoid it, I just never had any reason to sit down and read it. Nor was it required reading in any class I took. There came a time when I was visiting a friend that I saw that volume on a shelf, and since I had the time, I did sit down and read that book. I recall being disappointed. I don't know why. But there I was with that classic text from our national canon, and not only was I not elevated and inspired, I was, I think, bored. There he was, earnestly living alone at his legendary pond, and I didn't much care. Looking back, I think, it must have been me. I must have been mistaken. I must have been in a foul mood or in an unreceptive frame of mind. A man might meet his future spouse for the first time and be unmoved. It isn't love at first sight. It's nothing. It's only over time that a favorable impression is made and he learns to value her, to love her. Maybe that would be the same for me and Thoreau. So I got a copy of the book and I sat and held it. Walden is not a brief text, and I have many things to do. And I still had those buried bad feelings about it. And yet, I sat and I hemmed and hawed over this and finally decided on a compromise, which Thoreau, I believe, would have despised. He was one for full measures or none at all. My book contained not only the text of Walden, but also civil disobedience, or, more accurately and fully, on the duty of civil disobedience. That specific title because you do not enter into a dispute with the government on a whim. It's a serious matter. You are obliged to do it. The government forces you to resort to it. You have no other choice. Thus, it is your duty. To understate it, Thoreau doesn't like government, any form of it. Some were less repressive than others. All were reprehensible, infernal intrusions. In his own case, America, in the 1840s, Thoreau objected to paying taxes, for which he spent his famous night in jail, chronicled in this essay, the war with Mexico, and above all, slavery. Because the government was enforcing or simply permitting this evil, it was itself evil and absolutely had to be resisted. This made Thoreau especially valuable and relevant years later to Dr. King, who would echo his words. Thoreau believed in the rights and freedoms of the individual. I think living in America had spoiled him. There is no hint of 1984 in his writings of what a government could do if it was committed and regimented to rule. For Thoreau, government immediately and necessarily put limitations on his precious freedom, making government the opposition and wrong, no matter how the silky politicians would argue about it and defend it. Governments like toads seemed to exist of their own accord, and they were more or less constantly in the wrong. I think Thoreau was right. Government at all levels are wrong, but I'm not so sure they must therefore be resisted. We are living in a time when individuals from every direction are calling out the government, exercising their duty to resist it. When the government attempts to defend itself, it either looks like a chump or a goon. I find myself wishing, at least to some extent, that people would refrain from this hail of righteous civil disobedience. and instead reflecting on the imperfection of all human endeavor and realizing that any institution is more impaired the larger it is, they might absorb whatever insult or injury they have suffered, short of something so heinous as slavery, and do so in silence. That, I know, is a futile wish. Thoreau was notoriously a squeaky wheel. The squeaky wheels get the grease, and right now the wheels are squeaking like crazy. Grease is flying everywhere. What I said about America spoiling Thoreau, it's 100 times more pronounced today. Our government is not only wrong, it's also patronizing. Yet another classic case of two wrongs not making a right.